guy is coming. The dreamer of dreams, the dream master is coming. And we're going to see Joseph kind of God is going to start turning Joseph into, of sorts, a dream master in this section. So before we get started, let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the story of Joseph. Thank you for the example that he is to us from his time in prison and the patience that he showed, the growth that we see in his life. And pray that you would open the word for us, open our eyes to your word this morning, and give me the words to speak. And in Jesus' name, amen. So let's open your Bibles with me, if you will, to Genesis. We're going to start reading in Genesis in chapter 39, in verse 20. Actually, let's back up to verse 19. So this is Potiphar's reaction to his wife's accusation of Joseph. And it says, "So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, 'Your servant did to me after this manner,' that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." So the first thing that I want to point out, well, this is the second major failure, if you want to call it that, of people to Joseph. This is the second time in Joseph's life that people have failed Joseph. The first time was his brothers. His brothers failed him in a sense. They betrayed him. They sold him into slavery. And now this is the second time. I'm sure Joseph was feeling some sense of betrayal and unjustness, that sense of wrongness, that he was getting the short end of the stick. He was getting the wrong judgment. And for the second time in his life, after Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, one of the first statements that's made is, God was with Joseph. And now again we see here at the end of Joseph's time with Potiphar and the beginning of his time in prison, it says it 2 times. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And then again, God, the keeper of the prison, did not look didn't even bother looking into issues under Joseph's control, because he trusted Joseph so much, because God was with Joseph, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. And that's actually your first blank. If I can get it to work. There it is. It must have been quite a letdown, if you want to call it that, to go from being an important member of an important, or from managing the household of an important member of Pharaoh's court. Remember, Potiphar was said to be the captain of the guard, and so he was important in Pharaoh's court, and Joseph ran his entire household. So it was quite a letdown to go from that to being in prison, but God was still with Joseph. And as I mentioned, pretty soon Joseph was the guy running the prison. Now, I do want to make a quick little comment about prisons, because whenever I heard the word prison in reading the Bible, I think of, a dungeon or something along those lines, some sort of cross between a modern prison and a medieval dungeon is what comes to mind. But that wasn't really the case in the Bible. People were not usually held in prison for punishment like they are today. It was usually reserved for people who were awaiting trial, defaulting debtors, although oftentimes it was the wife or the children of the debtor who were put in the prison. Prisoners of war and political enemies. And oftentimes they would use existing structures like granaries, pits, or even private houses to house the prisoners in, rather than a large complex. So if we keep reading, we're actually going to, it says in verse 40, or chapter 40, verse 3, let's just read the first 3 verses. It says, "It came to pass in these days, after these things, that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined." So if you look at verse 3 there, it says that he was in the house of the captain of the guard. That was where Joseph was. So I don't think that Joseph was in charge of this massive prison complex, and that the guy in charge was just sitting around twiddling his thumbs and letting Joseph do all of his work. I think this captain of the guard that Joseph was under was probably in charge of all the prisoners, and maybe the prisoners were even scattered around the city or in a general area, but Joseph was in charge of his little area. And I found it interesting. Interestingly enough, I didn't see this pointed out in anywhere that I looked, but in verse 3, the guy in charge is called the captain of the guard. Well, if you go back to Genesis 39:1, at the beginning of Joseph's time with Potiphar, Potiphar is also described as a captain of the guard. And it's the exact same phrase in English and in the original language. So I wonder, this is pure conjecture, but I wonder if they were actually friends with each other. Or if I'm sure they at least knew each other. And so Potiphar's wife's accusation had obviously angered Potiphar, although we don't really know if he believed his wife yet or not, or if he was just frustrated with the whole situation. But we do know that he didn't want to kill Joseph, so he put Joseph in prison in the care of probably his friend. And maybe even Potiphar passed along a good word and said, hey, this guy's a solid guy. He just, my wife and all these things. And so you get him now. Here's my problem. You can take him. So, and while it seems like a step down, God is actually positioning Joseph for a major upgrade. As you all know with the story of Joseph, the next step is royal vizier for Pharaoh. But Joseph doesn't know that. He just knows that he's now stuck in prison. So, but one of the advantages of being put in a royal prison was that you got to interact with out of favor courtiers. and members of Pharaoh's court. So, as we just read in verses 1 and 2 or the first 3 verses of chapter 40, the chief butler and the chief baker offended their lord Pharaoh at some point during Joseph's internment, and Pharaoh threw them in the same prison that Joseph was in. If we can continue reading in verse 4, it says, the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, the butler and the baker, and he served them. So they were in custody for a while. We don't know exactly how long these two men were in prison, but I would argue that it was long enough for them to build at least some level of trust with Joseph, because otherwise they wouldn't have chosen to do what they did next with their dreams. And we do know that, based on some things later on in the text, that they were in prison awaiting trial. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So Joseph walks into their cell one morning, and he can see right away, obviously on their faces, that something's wrong. If we read on, and starting in verse 5, it says, then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning, and looked at them, and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? And they said to him, we each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. I want to camp on verse 8 there for a little bit, and Joseph's statement. Notice that he said, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me. Joseph in this statement is associating himself as a follower of God. He's making a statement that he is a follower of God, and God is the one that sent these dreams. These interpretations of these dreams belong to God. So therefore, he has the ability to tell them the interpretations. And in saying this, he's showing that he's starting to trust more in God for his life and his destiny. Because remember, he did have those two dreams back when he was a teenager. And God is working in his heart now. That teenage boy, those of you who were here last week will remember, I was puzzled. Why would Joseph say to his brothers twice, hey, look at these dreams that I had? Well, I was reading a commentator this week in preparation for this, and he explained it to me, and now that I see the explanation, like, oh well, duh, why didn't I see that? Maybe it was because I was never a little brother, I don't know. But little brothers like to push the buttons of their big brothers. And Joseph was a teenager, and he wanted to push his brother's buttons. And he was Daddy's favorite, and he knew it. And so as a teenager, I'm sure it wasn't the only time, those dreams just provided a really handy button to push and to shove it in his brother's faces. And of course it made his brothers angry, and that was probably the reason he did it, because he knew it would push their buttons. But God is working in Joseph's heart, and that teenage boy who brashly and proudly proclaimed his dreams to his brothers is now beginning to care more about others and less about himself. So if we continue reading in chapter 40, starting in verse 9, it says, Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. So remember, Joseph took a step of faith, and he said, I'm a follower of God. God will give me the interpretations of your dreams. And God rewards that step of faith. And he gave Joseph the interpretation of those dreams immediately. And it was good news for the butler. The good news was that the butler would, in 3 days, he would be tried, brought before a trial, and restored to his former position. Now, the phrase, let me find it. In verse 13, it says, In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. That phrase, lift up your head, is essentially meaning Pharaoh's going to put you on a pedestal of judgment before his court, his servants, and he's going to judge you and put you on trial. So that's where I'm getting that he would be tried. So in this case, the butler's dream meant that he would be put on display, and it would be determined whether he would be guilty or innocent. And in the butler's case, he was going to be innocent. And so Joseph includes in this interpretation, he includes a plea for the butler to remember him when the butler is released from prison. He says, Please remember me. I did this good deed for you. Please remember me and mention me to Pharaoh. I'm innocent. But even here, this would have been a great opportunity for Joseph to complain. Right? He had been mistreated by his brothers and sold into slavery. He had been falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. This would have been a prime opportunity for Joseph to say, I'm so right, they're so wrong, poor me, you should have pity on me. But Joseph doesn't do that. He gives the bare minimum details to basically say, hey, I'm here wrongly, could you please remember me when things are going well with you in Egypt, please remember me. And this is a glimmer of hope for Joseph that he's seeing an opportunity to maybe get out of prison. And the chief butler was, I'm sure, overjoyed at that this outlook was so favorable. And the good news bolstered the courage of the chief baker as well. So he told his dream to Joseph too. Picking up in verse 16, it says, When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost baskets were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now here again we see the phrase, lift up your head, although I wonder if Joseph is using a bit of a play on words when he says he's going to lift off your head. Meaning that Pharaoh was going to execute the baker the hanging that we see here is not what we would normally think of as a hanging. It's not what you saw in those old westerns, or what you think. It's not. That wasn't a form of punishment back in the day. This term hang was used to denote impaling, the gibbet, or crucifixion, all of those generally after death. Basically, it was a long-term exposure of the body as a form of aggravated punishment, as an aggravated form of punishment. And if you believe one commentator that I read, it was believed to extend even into the afterlife, because the act of not burying the body would keep the person's soul from resting in the afterlife. Now, I haven't personally heard of this before in beliefs of ancient Egypt, but I do know that it was held by ancient Greeks. It's not a foreign concept. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that this may have been the case, especially considering the Egyptians' elaborate burial practices. So picking up again in, oops, I never gave you guys your next spot. So continuing on in verse 20, it says, "Now it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. But the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." So 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and the dreams came true just as Joseph had predicted. Now, it might be somewhat surprising that Pharaoh was celebrating his birthday, because at least for me, I kind of see it as oh yeah, that's a fun thing that I do for my kids, but I don't really care that much about my birthday anymore as an adult. But for the royalty of the day, it was a common practice. This solemnizing of the celebration of royal birthdays was a common practice, and it was a way for the subjects of a king to recognize and honor him. And so as part of the celebration, Pharaoh brought out his butler and his baker for judgment or trial before his servants. Now, I think it could quite possibly be reasonable to say that it may have even been Pharaoh's custom to cast judgment on one or two legal cases on his birthday. We see that with the story of Pilate and Jesus. It was Pilate's custom to release a prisoner for Passover, and so he offered to release Jesus. I think this could possibly be a case of that as well. With the way that the passage reads, it sounds like the butler and the baker were probably in cahoots with each other. They were probably working together. They were probably equally guilty. So the fact that the butler may have owed his life to the fact that Pharaoh chose to give him amnesty and to pardon him, and chose to withhold that pardon from the baker. And in doing this, Pharaoh may have been trying to send a message to his followers that he was willing to be merciful. He wanted to be merciful, but he would also cast judgment that he needed to when when it was needed. Maybe the butler, or maybe the baker truly was more guilty than the butler. The Bible doesn't give us details about that. Or maybe Pharaoh just arbitrarily, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, okay, you're the one that's going to die. We don't know. But whatever the case may be, we can say for certain that the two men's dreams came true. The butler was restored to his former duties, and the baker died. However, as so often happens with humans, the butler quickly forgot about Joseph. And for the third time in his life, Joseph faces the shock and betrayal of humans failing him again. His brothers failed him, Potiphar failed him, and now for a third time, each time it was de-escalating in the failure. The first time, he was trying to make his brothers angry. He kind of got what was coming to him, honestly. Doesn't make what the brothers did right, but he was kind of asking for something along those lines. The second time, he was falsely accused, but at least there was a situation that looked bad. This time, there was the butler probably fully intended to remember him. There was no malice. He wasn't angry. He just forgot about him, like a normal human being does. Only this time, there is no, but God was with Joseph. So the question of the hour is, has God forgotten Joseph? And if we read chapter 41, verse 1, it says, then it came to pass at the end of 2 years. Joseph was in there for 2 more years. And he's left to ponder this question of, has God forsaken me? And next hour, we're going to dive into chapter 41. So I'm going to leave you hanging, even though you guys all know the story, so you're not really hanging. But we're going to dive into chapter 41, and we're going to see that the answer is no. God has not forsaken Joseph. God has a plan, like he always does, and it's for his best. So we're going to end a little bit early for this morning, and we will pick it up again next hour.